Good morning. We'll continue with the essay Mother Tongue by Amy Tan, which we were discussing in the last class. And I think we stopped at a particular paragraph wherein Amy Tan tells us that her mother's English wasn't very fluent. There was this Chinese accent to it, and it was choppy spoken grammar, which made it quite difficult for her friends to understand it, right? And she says, like there's something called the family talk, which went on within the family or between her and her mother, which an outsider wouldn't understand, but which was very familiar to her and her mother because they had got used to this kind of talk. So she gives us the example of her mother explaining about a political gangster in Shanghai and how the mother tells about this gangster wanting to become part of her family. And the way she explains that in broken English is written so that we would understand how her mother spoke. It would not be very familiar to people who were not familiar with her mother to understand it, but Amy Tan would understand everything that her mother spoke, even though the grammar was broken and the accent was quite flawed and it was choppy, right? So she explains that, and then we come to the next paragraph. It goes like this. You should know that my mother's expressive command of English belies how much she actually understands. Belies is fails to fulfill. She reads the Forbes report. She listens to Wall Street Week, converses daily with her stockbroker, reads all of Shirley MacLaine's books. Shirley MacLaine is an American actress, book with ease, all kinds of things I can't begin to understand. Yet, some of my friends tell me they understand 50% of what my mother says. Some say they understand 80 to 90%. Some say they understand none of it, as if she was speaking pure Chinese. But to me, my mother's English is perfectly clear, perfectly natural. It is my mother tongue. Her language, as I hear it, is vivid, direct, full of observation and imagery. That was a language that helped shape the way I saw things, expressed things, and made sense of the world. So she gives us an idea about the power of mother tongue or the power of her mother's language, right? So when she tells us that her mother was very fluent in English, especially the written part of it, right? Because she used to read a lot of books like Forbes report. She used to read Wall Street Week. She used to speak with stockbrokers. She used to read Shirley MacLaine's books. So she was quite fluent in English, especially the written version of the language. She used to kind of understand the written version, but when she because she understood the written version, she used to read all these books. But when she spoke, the accent was choppy, the grammar was broken, and it made it difficult for her friends to understand her mother. Some of her friends said they understood 50%, some would say they understood 90%, some would say they understood nothing at all, as if she was speaking Chinese, right? But to Tan, her mother's speech is very natural and very fluid because she has grown up hearing her mother's version of English all her life, and she understands it completely without any effort. And she says that is the mother tongue. And she speaks about the power of the mother tongue because that was a language which helped to shape the way she saw things, express things, and how she understood the world. So she says, though people don't understand what my mother speaks, I do understand. It is natural to me and it is my mother tongue because I grew up hearing only this. Lately, I've been giving more thought to the kind of English my mother speaks. Like others, I have described it to people as broken or fractured English, right? That's how she explains. But I wince when I say that. It has always bothered me that I can think of no way to describe it other than broken, as if it were damaged and needed to be fixed, as if it lacked a certain wholeness and soundness. I have heard other terms used, limited English, for example, but they seem just as bad, as if everything is limited, including people's perceptions of the limited English speaker. So she says, I've been thinking about the kind of English my mother spoke. And she says, I myself have described to people using the words broken English, fractured English. And she says, I feel bad about it. Now I cringe when I think that I have used this word broken, because I didn't find any other word to explain that. But it's like, when you say broken, it's something, something that is damaged, something that cannot be fixed, something that does not have wholeness, but it's not like that. My mother's English was not something that was not wholesome. That was something that shaped my growing up. And she says, I really cringe when I think of the way I use the word broken. She says, I've heard people using the term limited English, but even that is not a good word. Because when you say limited, it's as though you mean that everything is limited, including the perceptions of people, the impressions of people, right? So you cannot use words like broken, limited, fractured, especially to describe a language. He says, and I feel so ashamed, and I wince and I cringe when I think that I have used those words to describe my mother's English. I know this for a fact because when I was growing up, my mother's limited English limited my perception of her. I was ashamed of her English. I believed that her English reflected the quality of what she had to say. That is because she expressed them imperfectly. Her thoughts were imperfect. And I had plenty of empirical evidence, practical evidence to support me. The fact that people in department stores, at banks, and at restaurants did not take her seriously, did not give her good service, pretended not to understand her, or even acted as if they did not hear her. So she says that when I grew up, I was actually ashamed. And she says, I'm really ashamed to say that I was ashamed of my mother's English. So when I grew up, I was like, I used to wonder why she spoke like that, why she was kind of speaking this kind of fractured, broken English, right? So she says, I grew up like that, and I felt very ashamed of my mother's English. And she says, it's because, I saw how salespeople in stores or bank tellers ignored her, they demeaned her. And it was as the society was telling me that my mother's limited English is a huge embarrassing problem, right? And she saw that. She says, I had more than enough proof for that because I saw how people treated her, right? My mother has long realized the limitation of her English as well. When I was 15, she used to have me call people on phone to pretend I was she. In this guise, I was supposed to ask for information or even complain and yell at people who had been rude to her. One time, it was a call to a stockbroker in New York. She had cashed out her small portfolio, and it just so happened that we were going to New York the next week. Our first trip outside California. I had to get on the phone and say in an adolescent voice that was not very convincing, "This is Mrs. Tan." Right? So she says, Tan's mother knew that people perceived her as imperfect because the kind of language that she spoke was imperfect, right? And she would make her daughter pretend to be her on the phone in order to get the kind of treatment that perfect English receives. So she says, the mother also understood, and she used to make the daughter do that pretend to be her. So once she had to call a stockbroker, right? And pretend and say, I am Mrs. Tan. And because the money had run out, she had cashed out her entire purse, her entire portfolio in stocks, and they had to go to New York for a trip, and there was no money, so she had to call the stockbroker. And my mother was standing at the back, whispering loudly, why don't he send me check? Already 2 weeks late. So mad he lied to me, losing me money. So her mother was prompting at the back. So she had to take the phone and say, hello, this is Mrs. Tan. And then her mother said, why don't he send me check? Already 2 weeks late. So mad he lied to me, losing me money. Come on, speak to him. And then I said in perfect English, yes, I'm getting rather concerned. You had agreed to send the check 2 weeks ago, but it hasn't arrived. Now she uses perfect English to speak to the stockbroker. And then she began to speak more loudly. What do you want? I come to New York, tell him in front of his boss, you're cheating me? And I was trying to calm her down and make her quiet while telling the stockbroker, I can't tolerate any more excuses. If I don't receive the check immediately, I am going to have to speak to your manager when I'm in New York next week. And sure enough, the following week, when we were in front of this astonished stockbroker and I was sitting there red-faced and quiet, my mother, the real Mrs. Tan, was shouting at his boss in her impeccable broken English. So the funny result of this, that is Tan calling her mother, Amy Tan calling her mom stockbroker to complain about the delay, was that when later on Amy and her mom went to see him in person, he was surprised to see Mrs. Tan speaking to him with this broken English. The previous week, she had spoken to him in perfect English. So, Amy Tan says, I used to feel so embarrassed on such occasions. I used to feel so very bad because I felt ashamed of my mother. Today, I realize I need not have been. And I cringe when I think that I thought of my mother like that. We used a similar routine just 5 days ago for a situation that was far less humorous. So this situation with the stockbroker is a very funny situation. But she says there was another less funny result for a situation that was far less humorous. She goes on to say, my mother had gone to the hospital for an appointment to find out about a benign brain tumor a CT scan had revealed a month ago. She said she had spoken very good English, her best English, no mistakes. Still, she said the hospital did not apologize when they said they had lost the CT scan and she had come for nothing. She said they did not seem to have any sympathy when she told them she was anxious to know the exact diagnosis since her husband and son had both died of brain tumors. She said they would not give her any more information until the next time, and she would have to make another appointment for that. So she said she would not leave until the doctor called her daughter. She wouldn't budge. And when the doctor finally called her daughter, me, who spoke in perfect English, lo and behold, we had assurances the CT scan would be found, promises that a conference call on Monday would be held, and apologies for any suffering my mother had gone through for a most regrettable mistake. So this is another less funny incident. See, once Tan's mom was diagnosed with benign, not malignant, benign brain tumor, and she went to the hospital to get copies of a CT scan because she wanted to understand her exact diagnosis. Now, you should understand her mind frame. Both her husband and her son had died of brain tumor, so she did not want to delay any treatment or so if she had something like that. But she was extremely worried. But the hospital had misplaced her results. And because she was not able to speak perfect or impeccable English, they just ignored her. And despite her pleas that her husband and son had died of brain tumors and that she was extremely worried, the hospital refused to apologize for misplacing her test results. Ultimately, she refused to move from there. She said, I'm not going to move from here till you call my daughter. So when they called Amy, what happened is Amy spoke in perfect English without any accent, right? And then the hospital kind of suddenly, they pull themselves together, the hospital staff, and they're so deeply apologetic and they promise to correct the error. Now, what Amy wants to prove here or what she wants to point out is that when people did not speak good or impeccable or perfect English in the place where the others spoke real good English, they would not be taken seriously. So in America, people spoke perfect and impeccable English. And a person like Amy Tan's mother, who spoke broken, limited English with a heavy accent, with choppy grammar, would never be taken seriously. People wouldn't take her seriously. So people always give a lot of importance to language. But when Amy Tan calls them and speaks to them in good English or perfect English, see how the scenario changes. The hospital representatives become very apologetic and they promise to correct the error. So why didn't they do that with her mother? Because her mother did not speak good English. So this is how we see this kind of prejudice or this kind of discrimination existed in places where language was not spoken well. People who did not speak the language of that country well were not taken seriously. They were discriminated against. I think my mother's English almost had an effect on limiting my possibilities in life as well. Sociologists and linguists probably will tell you that a person's developing language skills are more influenced by peers. But I do think that the language spoken in the family, especially in immigrant families, which are more insular, means limited, plays a large role in shaping the language of a child. And I believe that it affected my results on achievement tests, IQ tests, and the SAT, Scholastic Aptitude Test, SAT, right? While my English skills were never judged as poor, compared to math, English could not be considered my strong suit. In grade school, I did moderately well, getting perhaps B's, sometimes B pluses in English, and scoring perhaps in the 60th or 70th percentile on achievement tests. But those scores were not good enough to override the opinion that my true abilities lay in math and science, because in those areas I achieved A's and scored in the 90th percentile or higher, right? So, Amy Tan wonders here in this paragraph whether her mother or the way her family spoke English could have limited her opportunities in life. So she speaks about the achievement tests that she had taken. On a variety of achievement tests, her results showed that math was by far her strong subject and that her English skills were mediocre, right? She found multiple choice my math tests easy because each question could have only one answer, whereas language questions always seem more nuanced and she could argue over the answer choices, right? So we come to that. This was understandable. Math is precise. There's only one correct answer. Whereas for me, at least, the answers on English tests were always a judgment call, a matter of opinion and personal experience. Those tests were constructed around items like fill in the blank sentence completion, such as, even though Tom was dash, Mary thought he was dash. And the correct answer always seemed to be the most bland combinations of thought. For example, even though Tom was shy, Mary thought he was charming. With the grammatical structure, even though limiting the correct answer to some sort of semantic opposites, so you wouldn't get answers like, even though Tom was foolish, Mary thought he was ridiculous. Well, according to my mother, there were very few limitations as to what Tom could have been and what Mary might have thought of him. So I never did well on tests like that. Because she said the reason was math tests were very precise. The question had only one answer, whereas language questions are not close-ended. They're always open-ended. You have a lot of nuanced answers and you have a lot of answer choices, like she gives the examples of analogies, right? She talks about semantic opposites. She says, you cannot, the word like the conjunction, even though is used there, and because of that, your answers are limited. Right? You cannot say Tom was foolish, Mary thought he was ridiculous. See, those kind of answers are not accepted. But she says, because there's no one correct answer. So what happened is I never did well in English papers. This was true with word analogies, pairs of words in which you were supposed to find some sort of logical semantic relationship. Semantic is meaning. Semantics means meaning. So, whenever you give a meaning or whenever you give a word, the meaning is always important, right? So you cannot say, you cannot use words like ridiculous, foolish, because those have got negative connotation, but they're not wrong. But usually such tests would kind of be difficult for her because she had a lot of choices and she wanted to give a lot of choices as answers, but she couldn't because it was always limited, right? And even with analogies, she says, like, the example that she gives, sunset is to nightfall as dash is to dash. Here you would be presented with a list of 4 possible pairs, one of which showed the same kind of relationship. Red is to stoplight, bus is to arrival, chills is to fever, yawn is to boring. This is analogies, comparison, right? And Amy found it hard to answer because she could plausibly connect all possible analogy pairs through imaginative leaps of logic. Right? So I could never think that way. I knew the tests were asking, but I could not block out of my mind the images already created by the first pair. Sunset is to nightfall, and I would see a burst of colors against a darkening sky, the moon rising, the lowering of a curtain of stars, and all the other pairs of words, red, bus, stoplight, boring, just threw up a mass of confusing images, making it impossible for me to sort out something as logical as saying a sunset precedes nightfall in the same way as a chill precedes a fever. Sunset comes before nightfall. So analogy or the cause and effect or the comparison is before a fever you have chills. The only way I could have gotten that answer right would have been to imagine an associative situation. For example, my being disobedient and staying out past sunset, catching a chill at night, which turns into a feverish pneumonia as punishment, which indeed did happen to me. So for her, it was always associations. She couldn't, kind of do this cause and effect thing because she was vividly imaginative. So when she would get a subject, a topic or a sentence like sunset is to nightfall, she would imagine the brightness of the myriads of colors, and she could never relate that to chills and fever and what the other words like bus stop and bus arrival, yawn, boring and all that. So she could never associate that. What she could possibly associate was having a kind of staying out after night, getting a chill, catching a cold, getting fever, getting pneumonia. All these things have actually happened to her. So for her, English tests were very difficult because she had always this vivid imagination, because she grew up in a family where the English was, according to her, quite broken, but which tried to create associations. I have been thinking about this lately, about my mother's English, about achievement tests, because lately I've been asked as a writer why there are not more Asian Americans represented in American literature, right? Why are there few Asian Americans enrolled in creative writing programs? Why do so many Chinese students go into engineering? Well, these are broad sociological questions I can't begin to answer. But I have noticed in surveys, in fact, just last week, that Asian students as a whole do significantly better on math achievement tests than in English. And this makes me think that there are other Asian American students whose English spoken in the home might also be described as broken or limited. And perhaps they also have teachers who are steering them away from writing and into math and science, which is what happened to me. Right? So she says, she wonders, is it because there are a lot of immigrants or people who came from Asia and settled in America, and because they have also grown up in the homes listening to this kind of limited broken English, could this be the reason that there aren't more Asian American authors? Or why isn't there a proportionately representative number of Asian American students in creative writing programs? Because she says that all these Asian Americans tend to do better on the math part of achievement tests. And is it because of the limited English that their parents speak? Or is it because the teachers are misguided and they guide them towards the field of engineering and math because they feel that these students cannot do good as writers? So that is her question. So she says, people ask me, why aren't there many Asian American writers? And my answer is, it's because I feel many of them have grown up in homes like me, where the mothers do speak choppy English, right? Where they do not have semantic notions, where we speak only through associations. And then what happens when we come to school, we're not able to do very well in English achievement tests. So our teachers feel that we're not good in English. So what do? They tend to guide us towards math. They tend to guide us towards science because they feel that we're not good in English, but we are. Only thing is, because of our upbringing, we are not able to get into the semantic notions of the language, but we are able to do justice to the language by using our own ways of imagination, our own ways of association. And Amy Tan herself is ample proof. She has become a writer, right? Fortunately, she says, fortunately, I happen to be rebellious in nature and enjoy the challenges of disapproving assumptions made about me. So she says, she rebelled because she did not want people to make assumptions about her. So people used to assume that since her mother did not speak English, and since she did not do very well in English achievement test, she could never be a writer, she could never major in English. So she wanted to prove them wrong. So she rebelled. I became an English major in my first year in college after being enrolled as a pre-med. So what did she do? So she rebelled against the science and math version. So she was put into pre-med. Pre-med is a course that you do before medicine. In America, it's like that. Before you do your medical course, you have to do something called pre-med, right? So she was put into pre-med class, but what did she do? She switched from there. So she jumped from there to graduate in English. I started writing nonfiction. As a freelancer, the week after I started, I was told by my former boss that my writing was my worst skill and I should hone my talents towards account management, right? So she started to work under a boss who told her that she couldn't write nonfiction, she couldn't write to save her life. So it's better that she moves towards account management. But she rebelled against that also because she wanted to write fiction and later she wanted to write bestsellers, right? But it wasn't until 1985 that I finally began to write fiction. Fiction is story, right? At first, I wrote using what I thought to be wittily crafted sentences. Wittily crafted sentences means imaginative crafted sentences. Sentences that would prove that I had a mastery over the English language. Here's an example from the first draft of a story that was later put into the Joy Luck Club, but without this line. This is a line in that was my mental quandary in its nascent state, a terrible line which I can barely pronounce, right? So what happens is, in her early writing, she wanted to prove that she had mastery over language. So she started using flowery, overly complicated vocabulary and syntax word order to demonstrate a proof to people that she could write. So she says, this is one of the lines which I wrote initially, but thankfully they did not put it into the novel Joy Luck Club, right? So she says, that was my mental quandary in its nascent state, in its beginning state. Quandary is problem. Now she says she used flowery, complicated vocabulary, right? It's a terrible line. According to Amy, it's a very terrible line which I can barely pronounce. Fortunately, for reasons I won't get into today, I later decided I would envision a reader for the stories I would write, right? So she realized later on that she needed to imagine a reader. She need not use complicated vocabulary and syntax to demonstrate her skills. Eventually, if you needed to be a good writer, you need to imagine a reader. Right? I later decided I would envision a reader for the stories I would write. And the reader I decided upon was my mother, because these were stories about mothers. So with this reader in mind, and in fact, she did read my early drafts, I began to write stories using all the Englishes I grew up with. The English I spoke to my mother, which for lack of a better term might be described as simple. So she says, no, I'm not going to use the term broken or fractured or limited. I'll just say simple. The English she used with me, for the lack of a better term, might be described as broken. My translation of her Chinese, which could be described as watered down, and what I imagined to be her translation of her Chinese, if she could speak in perfect English, her internal language. For that, I sought to preserve the essence, but neither an English nor a Chinese structure. I wanted to capture what language ability tests can never reveal: her intent, her passion, her imagery, her rhythms of speech, and the nature of her thoughts. So this is the native person style. Apart from what any critic had to say about my writing, I knew I had succeeded where it counted when my mother finished reading my book and gave me her verdict. So easy to read. So eventually she started to understand that if she needed to write well, she needed to imagine a reader. And the reader she imagined was her mother. So she tried to create an English that was true to what she imagined her mother's English monologue would be like, a version somewhere between English and Chinese. And she ends the essay saying that I knew I had succeeded where it counted. when my mother finished reading my book and gave me her verdict. So easy to read. So that is what she wanted. She wanted her works to be readable. So she wanted people to understand what she read. So when we just look at this essay, we understand how Amy Tan contemplates on how her background shaped her life, her education. It brought her shame, but ultimately how she learned to embrace her background. Right? So when we read through the essay, we understand the way Amy Tan was stuck between two worlds, right? When she was with her mother, she spoke in simple English, but when she was in the public eye, she shifted to an English that was more formal and acceptable, one that English speaking people would accept. So Tan relates her story of her mother. When she talks about that gangster, talking about a gangster, I had explained that in the last class. So she relates that story of her mother talking about a gangster that wanted her family in China to adopt him because her family had more status. Now, she tells us the story using her mother's language. And then we understand how expressive her mother's broken English is. It's full of imagery, right? It's so vivid, it's so much of detailing. The language may not be what we are used to, but the story is something which we can follow, right? It is so beautiful. Like the imagery is actually so vivid, right? And Amy Tan says that her mother's language is the language of her childhood. And it is so very clear and so much of images are there in that language. So she says, I have no difficulty in understanding what my mother says. And she also knows that this simple English is the same language that helped her to understand the world, helped her to formulate her views, and helped her to express herself, right? So when she starts the narrative, she says, I am someone who has always loved language. I am fascinated by language in daily life. I spend a great deal of my time thinking about the power of language, the way it can evoke an emotion, a visual image, a complex idea, or a simple truth. Now, when we read this, we understand the passion she has for English language, what it can do. She explains to her audience that she was introduced to English in many ways. And she gives us numerous examples of different languages from the different influences that she had in her life. So, when we read this essay, you look at the way she has used language in this essay, and it helps us to understand that we shouldn't base our judgment on someone's intelligence on the use of an unfamiliar language. That is what happened to Amy Tan's mother, right? She was always discriminated against because she could not speak perfect English. And for her, English was an unfamiliar language. And you have to really appreciate that after coming from China that she learned this much, right? So, Amy Tan in this particular essay recommends the use of concise, simple language, right? And she says that, you need to learn a new language because you have to fit in where you live, right? That is why she always says, she speaks about the Englishes, the word the Englishes. So she says, I grew up with a lot of Englishes. And there is more than one kind of correct English. And she also brings to our mind, or she brings to our knowledge, the narrow-minded views that many people have of people who come from different backgrounds or cultures. See, her mother's experience shows us that people would judge the way her mother spoke, and they would be judged to they would be very quick to judge her. And they would always assume that her mother was uneducated. But her mother was not. Like Tan says, she read the Forbes report, she listens to Wall Street Week, she converses daily with her stockbroker, she reads all of Shirley MacLaine's books. And she says she does all kinds of things I can't begin to understand. Right? So what is Tan trying to tell us? She's trying to tell us or tell the readers that you should accept things that make people different. She's telling us that, the society will always have misconceptions about people that come from different countries. But that should not be the norm. we should not kind of be judgmental, right? So in her essay, she uses this very easy to read language. If you have noticed, her language is very simple. Even without elegant words, we understand the complexity of the argument that she's making, right? And in the last paragraph especially, she is able to emphasize the way that she is more concerned with her audience, and she wants to be appealing to that. That is why she says, like, I knew I had succeeded when my mother finished reading my book and gave me her verdict so easy to read. Because she says she does not seek the approval of critics. She chooses not to write like a professor or an erudite scholar, because people might feel that she should be writing like that. She says, no, I am purely writing for my audience because I want my audience to understand my writing to the fullest, right? So one reason why Tan's writing is so easy to read is because she knows that most people who speak native Chinese have a hard time being understood by the English-speaking people. So she has a kind of sympathy for her audience, for her readers, because she feels she's always felt the pain of being treated poorly due to language barriers. She tells us, she gives us two instances where her mother was treated unfairly because she did not convey the kind of perfect English the other person wanted to hear, right? You remember the incident in the hospital, right? And see how her mother was treated and how she was treated. For not speaking perfect English, Tan's mother was treated very badly, and she was prevented from accessing her CT scan. She was prevented from getting the right services, right? So Tan shows us the problem. She also tells us why it is a problem. So the kind of writing style that Amy Tan has used in this particular essay, Mother Tongue, makes the essay feel like a conversation that we are having. So Tan is engaging the audience directly when she says, she says this, you should know that my mother's expressive command of the English language belies how much she really understands. By directly addressing the audience, she's able to show that she wasn't writing this essay just to share her ideas, because she really wants the reader to understand what is happening and why it is such a difficult situation. So she uses many storytelling techniques to make all the experiences feel very personal. So she makes the reader struggle to understand her mother. She makes the reader feel the frustration of the thick language barrier. As a reader, we are compelled to experience all of the confusion as if we are having a real conversation. So, as readers, we are made to feel empathetic towards the situation. Amy Tan knows what her mother means, and she really feels bad that others don't get to experience her thoughts and ideas. So, her writing style, especially in this particular essay, gives us a glimpse of what it must feel like to be stuck between two worlds, the Chinese world and the American world. We are made to feel the roadblock that is put in the way of her mother. And it creates a feeling of defeat, in her when she knows that her mother is capable of expressing her own ideas, but due to people's impatience, she has to constantly be a translator. So it is like, Tan's struggle between two worlds. That is what is emphasized in this particular essay. So that is all about the essay Mother Tongue. Any questions?